you ready, Frank?
Yep.
Okay, I'd like to call, it's today, 17th. The January 17th Board of Selectmen meeting to order. And this evening is going to be budget. Okay. And Pete, why don't you go through, since I don't have an agenda in front of me, why don't you go through the departments we're going to do?
Sure. We are going to be doing
Thank you.
an overview, benefits, capital and debt, and then public safety, police, fire and dispatch, town administration, that's town manager's budget, and then accounting and finance.
Okay, and then next week?
Next week, you'll be going through community services, public works, and enterprise.
Oh, okay.
And then we're wrap up.
And library.
Oh, and library. And Bob, the assessors, you can be in next week?
They'll be in early next week.
And the assessors will be here also?
Next week.
Next week. Steve, do you have anything to report this week?
Went to the Trust Fund Commissioners meeting with Pete on Thursday. Actually making some shifts and some changing in some investment strategy, which I think will benefit the actual trusts. But other than that, we also put the policy in front of them. And Pete presented what the intention of having a policy in a direction, because there currently is none. It's just under charter that we need to have a commissioner of trust funds, commissioners of trust funds. So they had some questions, and Pete's gonna respond to those, get back to them, and then it'll be probably from the board late March. So you know.
Okay, anything else?
That's about it.
All right. Ben?
Had the chance yesterday to attend the Martin Luther King Jr. Day celebration up at the high school. I just want to thank everybody for participating. It was a wonderful event. The singers from the school, the young man who did the monologue from To Kill a Mockingbird, which should be an excellent production when that comes to the high school in March, I think. The choir from the Korean church, which is amazing, and our own Reading community singers. We have an example here right now. Also did a great job. So just want to thank Pete and Superintendent Doherty and the Clergy Association and our committee on our Human Relations Advisory Committee for their work on putting the event together. It was really, really nice. And it's one of those things where every year I leave and I say, you know, there should be 500 more people in the community here, because it really is, you know, a wonderful chance to get together. So, just thanks.
And I was also there, and this main speaker was fantastic. She was excellent. She's a young woman. She's like 29 years old. And she has so many credits to her resume so far. I mean, she's a woman with a mission, and she was really good. And the whole thing was good, and it was wonderful to see all the kids. There were a lot of kids there because of the two choruses, two high school choruses. So, and Steve was there, and Steve's daughter did part of a reading, and she's a Parker student.
School, yes.
And she had such presence. I was so impressed. It's wonderful to see young people up. And
She did a good job.
she did an
She's very
excellent job.
excited.
Yeah. So it was great. And the only other thing I did last week, I think, was I had a Eagle Scout come over. You know how they like to talk to officials. So that was my week. Do we have any public comment? No? No public comment? Bill, what's the matter with you?
I'm just observing tonight.
You're just observing. Are you not sick, are you?
No.
Okay, just checking.
But if you want,
Thought you might have the flu.
but if you want, how's the 3 pieces of property coming that we voted to sell?
No.
That's not on the agenda.
We'll comment on that.
Pete will come, we'll get back to you on that.
Yeah, I've been there for 7 years now.
So, okay, Pete, you have a report?
I do. Actually, one part of the report is on the overhead. We are doing a styrofoam collection, which is a standing collection. So 7:30 to 2:30, Monday through Friday at the Public Works Garage. You can take styrofoam over to be recycled. We think we're the first in the Commonwealth. And we wanted to get it up and running right around the holidays because with all the packaging and stuff, there's a lot of styrofoam that's created. So we've had 4 containers full already.
I mean, there's a trailer in the back. If you go in, there's a big trailer and bring it in there. It's working out real well.
December, so.
Working out well.
Now, by weight, that's about 3 pounds, but volume is a lot. And to keep that out of the solid waste stream is certainly important.
Pete, that looks like plastic silverware in there, is it?
It is.
That's not styrofoam.
That gets recycled with styrofoam.
Are you kidding? Maybe you should go through all of those things that are sitting up there, because I'm going,
I think I made a copy in your packet, actually.
Okay,
So
'cause I'm having
it's on
trouble
page
seeing-
2 in your packet tonight. So meat and produce trays, they have to have a 6 on them, and obviously they need to be clean. Plastic silverware, and they ask that you bundle that together, just keep it in a baggie or something like that and put it in. White insulation board and coolers, things like that. Obviously, the white insulation board would be a lot of packaging and that sort of thing. They ask that you remove all tape, labels, and food particles, obviously, and you can take it down any weekday and put it in the bin.
So it has to have a 6 on it?
For the packaging, for the food packaging.
It has to have,
Should
like
have a
if you
6.
go out to a restaurant and you get a lot of those, if you're taking.
Yeah, there's-
That- I don't know if they have a 6 or not, I've never looked.
Probably.
Probably do. I think the standard, I think, is.
Yeah, let's hope.
But you're not taking styrofoam peanuts, packing peanuts?
We are, if they're the harder styrofoam ones, we
Okay.
are. The really soft
Yeah,
ones.
the
that
coating
seem like
makes a
foam.
difference. They have to separate it up, but it depends on the type, believe it or not.
Alrighty.
So more lessons in garbology.
Okay, thank you.
So just a reminder that the town election and presidential election are on March 6th at the Fox Field House. And related to that, all nomination papers need to be in by 7 o'clock this evening. So hopefully we'll know tomorrow or the day after exactly what the slate is, including for town meeting members. Census forms will be going out. Have they gone out yet, Bob? I haven't seen mine home yet, so they should be going out very shortly. And that is an easy way to license your dog, so please remember to do that. The Reading Cultural Council report for 2011 is in your packet, starting on page 3 through 5. And there's some interesting projects that they have funded this year. So they have very limited funds from the state and trying to spread it out as well as they can. I know the board's aware of it, but State Senator Catherine Clark and our State Representative Brad Jones, one of our state representatives, both representing Reading, will be recipients of an award at the Mass Municipal Association annual meeting this weekend, this coming weekend. Catherine Clark is one of the leaders in the municipal healthcare reform process, and Representative Jones is largely responsible for sponsoring the amendments to the FY 2012 budget that returned money to the cities and towns if the state surplus was over a certain amount. So really both champions of municipal issues for us this year. At Oak Tree, the modular units continue to go up. They're loading from Haven Street currently, and haven't had any major problems with that. Traffic is flowing well, directed by police officers during the day, and then it flows regularly at night. In Public Works, we're applying to Longhorn's Steakhouse for a trails grant. We're actually fairly confident that we'll be getting the grant in the amount of $15,000. The one element that we had included in the grant application was to fund part of the cost of the town forest master plan, and they would not fund that. So we're going to need to be looking for another $4,000 somewhere to do that. And then the styrofoam stuff that we talked about. And also in your packet is the capital improvement program in the last several pages. And that's all I have.
Okay, thank you.
Excuse me, the other thing I did want to mention and ask Greg to comment on just for a minute is the board's gotten a email from a resident concerned about the blasting at Pulte Homes.
Oh,
And so Greg can give us an update on that since that sort of falls in his department.
Okay.
Just like to give you a little bit of an overview and then touch base on that issue. The blasting is regulated under the Fire Prevention Code, and under that, they regulate what the, how powerful that blast can be, how it can affect the neighbors. The blast is required to put a seismograph out that measures both the ground vibration and also the noise. And there are requirements that you can't go beyond a certain amount for each one of those measurements. They also have to do, the blast also is required to do a pre-blast survey to go out and look at, offer a survey to property that's within 250 feet from the closest borehole. We require them to go 500 feet
I
out.
thought it was 500.
That's because we asked for that, because
Right.
that's such a big site that there would only be a few homes that would have been impacted. So we wanted to see it go up. So we asked for that to go out further. We have a fire detail on site that the blaster is paying for from the moment the explosives arrive on scene until the explosives leave, to make sure that they're stored properly and there's not going to be an incident involving the explosives. That person also gets the seismograph readings from the blaster after each blast, and he records that down. If there is a violation of the vibration or the decibel reading of sound, we issue a notice of violation for that. And after this person's complaint, there was 2 incidents that they exceeded the allowable of the vibration. And we issued a notice of brought the blaster in. We issued a notice of violation. We also reported that to the state fire marshal's office. And we required them to correct it. Basically, they had to re-engineer how they were doing the blasting. The blast had to redesign what he was doing. And we also have the fire prevention officer up there very regularly, not every blast, but he's up there 2 or 3 times per week for a blast to make sure everything is going properly as well. When we get a phone call or email or complaint from the resident, we follow up on that. So on this particular issue, one of the residents had a pre-blast survey, and she reported that, she reported to us on October 26th that she had damage. And we gave her the correct form to fill out. That has to be reported within 30 days of when the incident happened. She filled that out properly. We took that, had the blaster come in. He has to fill out some paperwork. He has to give us a copy of his log, and then we sent it off to the state fire marshal's office. They review it as well. And then the blaster's insurance company has to contact that resident within 30 days, which they did. Well, they just took the information from the blaster and reviewed it. Based upon the reading, they determined that there couldn't have been damage done to that home, and they just sent a letter off to the resident. They didn't go out to the resident and look to see the damage. And the letter to the resident wasn't happy, wasn't pleased with the letter from the insurance company. And we followed up with that. We called the insurance company, and they took the position that the readings were such that they felt it couldn't have done damage to the property, and they weren't going to proceed with any claim. We recommended that because the resident had a pre-blast survey, has video that I didn't see the video, but she has video that indicates that there isn't any, that the damage wasn't there, and then now there is, that she contact her insurance company, file a claim with her insurance company, and have them go after the blaster's insurance for the damage. I can't revoke the blaster's permit because their insurance company won't have it on this particular thing. I can revoke their permit for cause. If there's a pattern that they're not doing the right things, I can. But for their insurance company, I can't revoke the permit based upon that. So we followed up with the resident and gave him that information and talked to the resident.
Sometimes it's better to have 2 corporations going after each other than a corporation on the pure part, their insurance company going after
We also followed up with the marshal's office too, after receiving that letter, and asked, is there anything else that we can do? And with the fire inspector from the marshal's office said that we've done everything we can by the statute, and you know, their next recourse is to their insurance company.
Chief, you said the two incidents where the readings were higher than allowable,
Yep.
they occurred after this
Yeah,
date?
yeah. The complaint was for October 26th, and the two incidents that went over the allowable were on November 9th. So it was after that report.
However, the insurance is in place in case, I don't think it has to go over a decibel level, right, for insurance to kick in.
There's scientific studies that show that, it's based on a graph, that at the lower end there'll be cracks to plaster, and then up on the way top end of the vibrations, there'd be cracks to cement and concrete. And at that time, I want to say the decibel, the seismograph readings were in the 0.59. The violation occurs at 2.0. So it was significantly lower than what's allowable. And so that's why they say they denied the claim. There are other things going on in the site as well. There's a lot of compaction going on. There's a lot of heavy equipment going on, going back and forth. So I'm not a soils person. So I don't know if there's something else that could have occurred. It could be the blasting. It could be, you know, ground compaction. It could be a lot of things. And I think that's why the resident would be far better off going through their insurance company and file a claim with them and let those two insurance companies hash it out.
If I could suggest something, I think the board should have a letter going to both insurance companies. I mean, we had a public hearing. Those neighbors were told, because they were concerned, they were told that they would be protected by the insurance policy. And now they're pulling this. I mean, they should have stated up front if they were gonna have exceptions or have thresholds that they had to meet. We were told they go in and they do an analysis, is what they said. We'll go in, we'll take pictures, and if you have a problem, our insurance covers it. This is really not setting well. So I feel that a very strongly worded letter should be going to both insurance companies, to Pulte and to the, oh God.
Plastic company?
Thank you, the blasting company. I mean, I just, that really, that just isn't how we do business in this town. No wonder the woman's beside herself.
No, I don't, you know,
Yeah.
this is, I have great sympathy for the people in that area. There's, you know, a lot of construction in that area. The MWRA, there was a lot of blasting, that was in the overnight hours. And now there's been a substantial amount of blasting for this project, and it's gonna continue for 8 to 10 weeks. And I can imagine it's hard. I live very close to that neighborhood. I can see some of the buildings from my home, and I can felt the blast from it. And they're significantly closer than I am. So I definitely sympathize with them. That's a large construction site.
Does the board have a problem with that?
No. Did they stop for a while with their blasting?
There's been a few days that they've stopped, but it's
Pretty much been since
Okay,
then.
yeah.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Bob, do you have anything?
No, I don't.
Okay. So we're ready for budget?
We're ready for budget. Bob's gonna lead us off. And I'm gonna turn down the light here just because it's sheds a little bit better.
I'm going to start with just a couple of slides to more or less describe to the public the process that's happened since the last public meeting, which would have been the financial forum in the fall. All the municipal departments got together and created what is called a level service budget for about $15.4 million. You can see that on the slide. Now, just as a way of comparison, this year in FY12, that budget is $14.8 million. So that's a bit of a jump for level service, and the first thing that needs to be explained is level service includes things like our CASA not being funded by a grant. So there's some things in there that, although not new, they're new in the general fund, which is why it's a bit of a jump. When we spoke with FinCom in October and got guidance to use up to $1.5 million for free cash, that was, depending on how you look at it, that was a 2% cut to the level service budget, or a 2% increase versus the FY12 existing operating budget, same thing. So the first thing we did was cut $300,000 out of that level service budget. But then over time, and I'll get to this on the next slide, we had a lot of positive developments, mostly on the expense side, some on the revenue side. And the budgets that you have in front of you are actually $15.3 million, only a 0.5% cut in the operating budget, or $77,000. And here's some of the reasons why. Here's what's changed. It's almost $1 million, it's a little over $1 million of the net positive change. About $250,000 is from revenues, and that's primarily driven by that top number, the assessor's overlay account. Going back to October, the assessors had over $1 million in the overlay account that was really not necessary, and they've agreed to at least begin by releasing $225,000 more than the $150,000 we had budgeted for, so that's $375,000. At the same time, they released some new growth figures which happened to offset what they believed was an increased need for abatements, for reserve for abatements. And lastly, some enterprise fund support transfer payments went up slightly. So that's about $250,000. But certainly the best news was on the cost side, and some of this happened very recently in the first few weeks of December. $500,000 were cut out of the assumption on special education out of district. A lot of that, more than half of that, is an assumption based on some pretty good understanding that the circuit breaker will be funded very well this year. Some of it is actual cut in costs for tuition and transportation, but most of it is the circuit breaker. We had another terrific result on energy costs. If you remember, the district went over to natural gas a few years ago, and natural gas is at almost record lows for 10 years. So that's worked out well as opposed to my oil heating bill that I just got for $700. And lastly, our enrollment in the vocational education program is lower, so we're actually able to chop $84,000 off of what we had assumed last October. So the balance of that is over $1 million. And I'll turn it over to Pete to explain how half of that was set aside from some accommodated costs that we had not originally intended, and the other half was let flow through the operating budgets. Pete?
Thank you. One of the things that we haven't used very much in accommodated cost that we have had there as a placeholder specifically to address issues like this is the community priorities. So these are intended to be things that are sort of a community-wide issue. It's not related to just one single budget, and is an extraordinary kind of effort or extraordinary kind of expense. And as you know, we had 3 community dialogues last fall following a couple of violent deaths in Reading in one case, and of a Reading resident in another case related to substance abuse. And the superintendent of schools and the police chief and our CASA director and Bob and I met quite a bit to strategize as to how we should handle these things. So what there is $620,000 approximately set aside, part in this budget and part as amendments to the budget in the fall, depending on how new growth comes in. So $500,000 is in this budget. $332,000 of that is in the school area for behavioral health programs and health education, and the superintendent has started to do his presentations to the school committee on those. $171,000 is in the town side, and of that, approximately $100,000 is for additional police staffing, and about $75,000 is funding for the staff of our CASA. As you know, our CASA, Reading Coalition Against Substance Abuse, staff are paid through a 5-year federal grant. That grant expires actually this coming fall, the end of September. We are going to make an application for an additional 5-year cycle on the grant. There are only 75 grants available nationwide, so it's going to be a very competitive process. But we're going to make the strongest grant application we can and ask for help from our federal legislators and anybody else who can give us help in that. But we also need to be aware that if that program, if we're not successful in that grant, and if we want to keep the good work that our CASA is doing, that we need to at least fund those salaries for our fiscal year 2013. And then the $115,000 would be deferred until October 2012 town meeting and implemented depending on new growth. As you know, when we did the studies of the Pulte development primarily, we looked at what within that development we generate additional demands on services for town and school services. And public safety is the area in the town where the service demand increases. It doesn't in public works, for example, because they're all private roads, it's private rubbish collection and so forth, but it does in public safety. So we want to make sure that we are able to tap that for public safety in the fall, assuming that the new growth is there this fall. If it's not, then we'll look at it the following spring and see what we can do. The next thing that I wanted to review with you is just to suggest some additional initiatives that the board might want to consider. We went through this process last year, and I thought it worked out fairly well, actually. Some of the initiatives were successful, and some weren't, but at least the issues were brought up in some kind of a comprehensive manner. So the ones that I've identified, and some will be familiar to you, is at the 2012 annual town meeting, to establish an other post-employment benefits, or OPEB, trust fund and begin to fund it. And we'll talk a little bit more, probably not tonight, but as we get a little bit further along and see what our financial situation is as to what some of the funds are that might go into that. The second would be to implement the first phase of funding various projects from one-time revenues. I made this presentation to the Board of Selectmen in the fall and then a town meeting in the fall. Most of those are from 40R funding. There's close to $1 million that we should have in the bank. $700,000 we have accessible to us now because building permits have been issued on both the 40R sites, and another $309,000 we submitted the invoices to the state to reimburse us. So that's cash in hand now. That's intended to address one-time expenses. So capital would be the primary one of those. And so what we're proposing is $231,000 in additional money for road improvements, an additional $50,000 in pedestrian safety improvements, so that would be done this spring. The third would be to consider a home rule petition to amend the charter regarding the size of town meeting. We're doing some analysis right now, but if you look at a 5-year average in terms of the number of people who actually run for town meeting as opposed to get written in with 1 or 2 votes or get appointed by town meeting, town meeting is probably a little bit larger than we can sustain as a community. And so we'll have that information together for the board at your first meeting in February, and the board can determine whether or not to do this. The process here for a charter amendment would be, because this addresses the method of election of town meeting members, our charter carves out an exception that that's not something that can just be done by town meeting and then go to the ballot. That this would go as a home rule petition to the legislature. If the legislature approves it, then it would go on, go to town meeting approves it, legislature would have a year to approve it, then it would go on the ballot next spring. So something to talk about, and it's enough of concern, especially as we started getting nomination papers in for this town meeting. It looked like it was really light right out precincts. For the 2012 subsequent town meeting, we would be suggesting that we look at amendments to the home rule charter regarding the number of members of the Council on Aging. I think Steve and Camille have had discussions seriously with the chair of the Council on Aging. It's a 10-member body, and that really seems excessively large. One of the options would be to give some wiggle room in the charter so that the Board of Selectmen can appoint, at least 6, but not more than 10, or however. We need to amend the zoning map because of inconsistencies over the years. We haven't always updated the map. At least town meeting has approved the amendments to the map, so we need to make sure that that's all done properly. Amend the zoning, adopt zoning amendments to encourage redevelopment of the industrial zoning district on Ash Street. We made a presentation to the board last fall. Gene is doing some follow-up on that, and we'll see what we can come up with as a package of zoning amendments related to that property. Consider updating portions of the zoning bylaw. You know, we've had this as a big project, but we may be able to pick away at a couple of pieces like the definition section on the parking and loading. And really look at doing something a little bit better with signs. We made some amendments. It's not the, you know, sort of the substance necessarily of the sign regulations, but it just reads horribly. It's much too long, much more complicated than it needs to be. And in fact, one of the things that we were looking at is whether it should actually be a general bylaw instead of a part of the zoning bylaw. And then amend the historic demolition delay bylaw to provide for more participation in the process of adding to the inventory, and also provide a process of appeal for the imposition of a delay. This is the discussion that you had with the maker of the construction motion. Administratively, there are actually two standing committees that the board has established that have sunset clauses in it. And those actually sunset on June 30th of 2012. One is the Advisory Committee on Cities for Climate Protection, and the other is the EDC. And so you need to make a decision as to whether or not you want to continue those. And then I would suggest that there are three other standing committees that you have that we actually ought to put those sunset clauses in, so that there's an opportunity every 5 years to look at them and make sure that they're doing what you want them to do. One is the Human Relations Advisory Committee, one is the Trails Committee, and one is the Reading Fall Street Fair Committee. Establish a policy regarding the responsibilities of the trust fund. Steve mentioned something we should do. Establish a process for the acceptance of Old Sanborn Lane as a public way. I've had discussions with a lot of residents from Old Sanborn Lane, as you can imagine, since we sent our letter out in December. And my sense is that there is an interest in doing a better process. And I think we should, you know, sort of grab that opportunity and encourage it and move that forward. The next item is to enter into discussions with the MWRA on the replacement of the Bear Hill water tank. The larger water tank takes your wheel on the MWRA. We ought to come to conclusion on it one way or the other. Either we're going to do it, how are we going to do it, or we're not going to do it. We'll make plans to replace that tank ourselves. The Board of Health has had a proposal in front of it to not allow the sale of tobacco products in pharmacies, so I think they should be encouraged to make a decision on that one way or the other. And one of my favorite, just to throw out something, you know, kind of wacky, like plowing sidewalks, you know, that sort of thing, is, and no community our size has done this yet, but if you look at the proliferation of plastic bags that you get in every store, you know, in every community across the country, and you see where they wind up, and you know that they do not wind up in our recycling bins because you can't recycle those. We don't have a mechanism available to recycle them. I think it's something that we need to have a discussion on, whether we actually go to the point of having a bylaw on it or not. I don't know, but get the business to come out.
They're doing that in California.
They are, but for larger communities, either the state's doing it, or counties, or very large cities. I don't think any towns the size of Reading that I've seen have done it, but Seattle, you know, in Washington, you know.
They do it?
Yes. They either do it or they tax it. So yeah, it's the other way of handling it. But we do so well with our recycling. I'm so proud of the work that the community is doing in terms of embracing our recycling programs and really making them work. This is another major area that we just don't have the ability to deal with. Who's next, Bob? Yeah.
I'm just going to go over the revenues that we talked about back in October. The first revenue, property taxes, is up 2.5%, but we have factored in just under $200,000 more in new growth once we got the final new growth for fiscal year 12. So that will factor in, but we also factored in about another $50,000 more in the reserve for abatements for the assessors because they requested a little more in that account. Under local revenues, they're pretty close to level funded. We did find that the motor vehicle excise tax for fiscal year 11 was much higher than we estimated. We thought it would continue to drop, but it didn't, so we didn't feel we needed to be as conservative in that line item, so we did increase that by about $100,000, and then the meals tax is up. We're gonna experience a full year of that, so we're anticipating a little more in that account as well.
You
So
know,
for local receipts.
what is the meals tax to date? What have we raised?
It's around $140,000 in fiscal year 12?
Since July, you're saying?
Right.
Since July,
It's running at about 75,000 every quarter, and the quarter is lagged, so it's not a fiscal quarter, it's a month later.
So we've gotten two.
so we're way ahead of what we thought we were gonna
You know, our best quarter, if that's annualized, will be at $300,000 a year. But that's our best quarter, we don't know if that's sustainable.
be. You know, the only other thing, sometime could we get, it'd be nice to know where the new growth was and
Oh, like a
what,
history,
yeah,
maybe?
well, give us what parcels, you know, what caused the 200,000 in new growth.
Okay, yes,
Because,
that's-
I mean, that would be great sometime.
And then intergovernmental is mostly our local, state aid from the cherry sheet. So we've level funded that. We haven't heard any new information coming out of the State House as far as what direction the governor might be going. So we're leaving it at level funded. There was an extra about $200,000 that we got a one-time amount in fiscal year 12, but we're not including that in this estimate. So that's why it looks like it went down just a bit for the intergovernmental. So, but generally it's level funded. And then transfers and available funds includes money that we're using for from the sale of real estate funds, $250,000. It includes the ice arena and the light department's earnings distribution. A lot of different things go into the transfers and other available funds. But the one change that we have from October is that the assessors did release some of their overlay, and while we were estimating it would be $150,000, it was closer to $375,000. So we have another $225,000 there that's adding to the available funds we have. So altogether, over fiscal year 12's budget, we have $1.86 million to work with. And in fiscal year 12, we used $860,000 in free cash, and we're proposing at this point in time to use $1.5 million in free cash. So that increase would give us $2.52 million to work with as far as covering any increased expenses for the fiscal year 13 budget.
Gail? The obvious question that comes to mind, somebody's going to ask it, so I may as well right now, is that if the overall revenues are up that much, do we really need to look at using $1.5 million in free cash for the budget?
What we're suggesting actually is that, excuse me, the intergovernmental, we think we've been conservative. If state aid comes in higher, then we would reduce use of free cash by that amount. The other on the expense side is our health insurance. We budgeted a 10% increase. If that number comes in lower, we may use that option as free cash. We think we've been conservative on both of those. We'll know, Bob is going to the MMA on Friday morning instead of me, so we're speaking, so we'll have a general idea, and then MMA will have numbers out the following week, so we'll have a much better idea at that point, at least what the governor's proposal is. And on the health insurance, we've taken bids through our consultant. They're analyzing bids, so we haven't seen them yet. We're meeting next week, and so, within the next week or two, we'll have a much better idea of where that is. But absolutely, the intent is to reduce.
And then an update on reserves. Status of our reserves. We started with free cash on July 1st of about $5.5 million. We did use some at the November town meeting, $59,000. Our general stabilization fund has $1.5 million, and FinCom reserve still sits at $150,000, which gives us $7.1 million in reserves available to use. And again, we're proposing to start off with this $1.5 million to support the fiscal year 13 budget, which would leave us with about $5.6 million. And The finance committee's reserve policy of 5% would be 3.7 million, so that puts us about $1.9 million over the finance committee reserve. So we're still staying above that amount while we're still proposing to use this 1.5 million to support the fiscal year 13 budget.
And just to be clear, we're not counting as part of our reserves the remaining balance on sale of real estate, nor are we counting the 40R stabilization fund, which we hope to use for capital. So those, you know, if you're counting all reserves, you could add those. We're not trying to stretch that. We're trying to be realistic about the sort of ongoing reserves, if you will, as opposed to one-time.
The next section, if you look at the slides up front, sometimes on the bottom there's a little hint as to what pages in your packet to look at. So 6, 7, and 9, 10 are up now for benefits. I'm not going to say a lot about health insurance. We do have a meeting next Monday. I will tell you categorically that we will not use the money we budgeted for health insurance. It is good news. How much good news, we'll know much better on Monday. The budget as built was a 10% increase, plus the budget we have this year is a surplus, so it was effectively more than a 10% increase. Enrollment in the last year has leveled off a little bit. It had been going up 2 to 3% a year, primarily driven by the school department. For some demographic reasons, they were having older teachers leave the workforce that were often not on the town's health insurance and retiring, and younger teachers coming on, often taking an individual plan. So for about 3 or 4 years, there's been a fairly good increase in health insurance enrollment for that reason. It slowed down this year. We don't know what it'll be next year. We did reduce some positions last year, so that also cut down on some health insurance enrollment. The pension funding is not quite as high as it was last year when it was a 4.5% increase, just 3.5% this year. The pension board in the future would probably ideally like to target 2.5% as an annual number, just in conjunction with Prop 2.5. But they're still feeling like they need to make up for some of the losses a few years ago. And for those of you that don't know, the way the pension funds work is they take a very long-term smoothing process. So it's not that the value of the pension funds in an actuarial sense drops 40%. It's just that still they never recognize the full gains, nor do they recognize the full losses. It's just smoothed out over time. So they do need to ramp up that number a little bit. Reading is scheduled to hit its full funding liability number sooner than is required by law. I think in the next year we'll probably start having a discussion considering the pension fund and OPEB and different strategies for attacking both. To the extent that you want to start funding both more aggressively, one of the options is just to fund the pension fund more aggressively because the legislation is not fully caught up with OPEB. We can't invest our money to fund OPEB quite as aggressively as we can in pensions. Of course, that would have helped us a few years ago. And then the other is the legislation is expected to catch up next summer, so we could start funding OPEB much more aggressively at that point. So I think that'll be a topic that's up probably between now and the April town meeting, as well as next fall. As Pete said, we are going to establish a trust fund, and we will have some options on the table to fund it right away. And the unemployment budget was reduced because we really didn't see nearly as much call on unemployment this year as we had expected, given the difficult budgets from last year. And the budgets in front of you have essentially no reductions. For the capital plan, I handed out tonight a revised capital plan. The only really meaningful change for FY13 is that the Public Works folks today decided to buy one big snow plow instead of 2 smaller ones. As soon as they saw 2 inches of snow today, they panicked. So that starts on page 6, which describes the capital that's requested for FY13. But let me show you a little bit more of a backdrop. Here's the list that's in front of you. I won't go over that in detail. It's just a bunch of line items for next year. But I think the lesson here, and it's a little hard to read, the numbers are a little bit small, Well, the numbers are very large, but if I stand really close. At the top here, we've usually put some kind of a note in the capital plan, just saying we're using some sale of real estate money. But this is more of a plan showing you how it's going to be drawn down over the next few years. Now, this does not include if Reading does sell some of the land that Bill Brown has already left in discouragement about. We'll replenish this fund by a few $100,000 here and there. But right now, it's on path to be drawn down by FY16 by using some in the capital plan. And down below, as Pete started to mention, is the 40R funds. So we know there's 700,000 in there right now. We're expecting probably another 150 plus 159 sometime in the next 6 months. And then 150,000 a year for the next few years, at least from Pulte. So the plan in front of you anticipates spending about $1 million and leaving about $500,000 still on the table from those one-time funds. And specifically, in April, you'll see a request for $281,000. That's $231,000 for roads and $50,000 for sidewalks that was discussed at November but tabled. And then next year, probably in November town meeting, not as part of the annual process, there'll be another $355,000 suggestion for road improvements. So that this is all now in the capital plan so you can see it as additional one-time funding. And the projected use is from, again, 40R funds. In balance, this capital plan for 10 years is a little out of balance next year. We have $86,000 more in requests than we have funding, which really isn't so bad. That list in front of you will have to pare down by $86,000 or find a little bit more cash. But the really interesting and good news for this is the plan is balanced for the first time since I've been here over 10 years. We have a $62,000 surplus by spending $27 million in capital in the next 10 years. And a big reason for that is the fact that the debt service has really leveled off, that we have not issued a lot of new debt. We were really on quite a pace there for a while. When the town got to do a lot of the school repair work inside the tax levy, that really crowded out capital for a while. We really haven't issued much debt this year. Actually, next spring, we pay off the final debt payment on this building, which frees up $400,000 in capital next year. And when you think of the four big issues on the plate that probably will be financed by debt, Killam and the library will probably be done as debt exclusions, not inside the levy. And then the cemetery garage and the public works facility are each about $1 million to $1.5 million. They'll probably be done inside the tax levy, but that's really not a lot of debt planning in the next 5 years on the horizon. It's really pretty well at hand. And I think Joe Huggins would agree that the facilities are really in very good shape by and large. Killam does need some work. The library does need some work. The rest of the buildings are in pretty good shape. If you look at the school capital plan in particular in these areas here, the only real demand they have for money in the next 10 years is to fix roofs. So there's very little else that they need. They've done a good job and a lot of work on energy. They've done a lot of facilities work in electric. And really, they're just left with roofs as large items. So it's good to see that the capital plan, you know, through a couple of tough years, we stuck to the 5% and a little bit more, and I think the community is going to see the payoff for that. I remember not that long ago when I was on FinCom, I think we did $60,000 in capital one year, and those were kind of the difficult years where it's easy to ignore, but you really have to stick to it. In terms of debt service, again, this police building is coming off. There's not really much planned. And the other things in your packets on pages all the way up through 2022 and 25. A couple people have asked me in the past about state assessments. So I wrote up a little bit more than usual. I'm not sure if I'll pass that along to town meeting, but starting on page 8, there's just a little bit more of a write-up about all the different categories that are on the cherry sheet. Primarily, it's the MBTA is the big charge. That's almost $500,000 projected for next year. But there's a bunch of smaller charges in there that some people have never heard of.
The charter school tuition and the school choice, we're charged that even though we don't have either of those programs?
We have students that have enrolled in those programs.
We
That's why
do?
we're charged. Yep.
Other
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have a charter school in Reading, but if somebody goes to a charter
Oh,
school in
really?
Malden from Reading, then we're charged for that.
Oh,
Yeah.
I assume there's not too many.
No, they
That's
have-
probably 2 in school, charter school, and might be 3, it's 2 or 3, and school choice is probably 1.
Okay, what are we on to, Jack?
Yeah, we're pretty much finished all that exciting stuff. Now, I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview of all the municipal departments before we start talking to department heads. Again, we sort of look at budgets 2 ways. The FinCom guidance is on operating budgets, and that's not counting accommodated costs. And the guidance we got from FinCom on the $1.5 million ultimately led, instead of a 2% increase, to a 3.5% increase, which is what you see in the bottom, and what drove Ben's question. It is a big increase, but you'll see why. So that's, as we did last year when we started reducing budgets, we started by trying to treat every department the same. Everyone gets 3.5%. How does that work? It just doesn't work. There's some things in here that we'll go over tonight and next week. You'll start to understand some of the differences, but you can see public safety is one of the areas where some of this is going up a little bit more than others. And you can see it's very uneven, and we'll get into that. In terms of the budgets the town meeting will see, they won't know about operating budgets. This is what they'll see. Certainly the number that jumps out is the 6.4% on public safety. And again, we're going to discuss that partly tonight and partly in the next couple of weeks. I did want to mention that the number in there that says FinCom for $150,000, that was not in the handout that I had sent to you last week. For some reason, that didn't show up in the chart. But all the totals and the other numbers were right.
So this budget is the operating budget plus accommodated costs. That's why this one is larger. So if there's something that's a community priority, for example, it's shown on this slide, not the previous one. Things like the FinCom Reserve Fund is an accommodated cost, so that's shown.
So if you look at the police budget, for instance, and Jim will get to this shortly, you see a 4.4% operating increase on this page. But then when you factor in the things that Pete mentioned in terms of new staffing in our CASA, that grows to 8.9%. And those are the accommodated costs, that portion, $171,000 of the community priorities added into that budget. So again, the budgets that FinCom and the town meeting will see on the town side are 4.1% increases on the department side, including FinCom reserves.
So expenses are up 4.1 and revenues were up 3.3 or 3.5?
3.5, I think.
3.5, so the delta
Free
is
cash.
covered by
The difference in free cash right now.
free cash.
Yep. In terms of full-time equivalents, you know, it's grown because we're taking some people in that were covered by a grant in our CASA's case, and 1 new hire in the police department. Otherwise, there's no change in staff net. There's a couple of pluses and minuses that we'll get into with each department in terms of some seasonal employees. And I think in the handout I had to you, for some reason it said 204.5, it's really 204. So the workforce, although growing next year, is it still lower than it was 5 years ago? So with that, I think we'd like to turn it over to Chief Burns to talk a little about fire and emergency management.
We're going to move the department head up here that's presenting so they can at least be partially seen.
And that's pages 60 and 63 of your packets.
You're in the hot seat, Greg.
Thank you. The fire department is responsible for 4 major functions: fire suppression, fire prevention, emergency medical system, and also emergency management. As part of emergency management, we're also responsible for coordinating prior for all reimbursements from state and federal disaster declarations. And we just completed the filing last week for the tropical storm during the summertime, and our allowable expenses were $27,000. We'll get reimbursed at a 75% of that, so the town will receive back, you know, a little over $20,000 for that response to the top of the storm. Thursday, I go to an applicant briefing. We're going to start the process for reimbursement for the October 29th and 30th snowstorm that we had. So we hope to recoup some of our costs for that. The other thing is, last week we were notified by FEMA that we received the Assistance to Firefighters Grant Program. And we're going to do a joint training program with Reading and Wakefield firefighters in engine company operations, ladder operations, and emergency vehicle operations. That's kind of the highlights. I thought I'd just touch base on that. For the fiscal FY13 budget, we're retaining the same people to be able to staff as we are now. The increases in are a result of some costs that are going up on our expense side because of state requirements. We have to have we have to report a number of different sets of information to the state for every patient we transport. So we have to have a software program for that, and we have to pay a licensing fee for that. But on the expense side, we have, on the salary side, we have 5 firefighters still going through the step process. We're also seeing some of the officers and firefighters getting degrees, so that's kicked up the salaries a little bit. And we've increased the overtime in order to hit a more realistic level to reduce the coming back for transfers. On the expense side, we increased the line item for uniforms a little bit because of the contractual requirement. And for non-union people, they're eligible for a 2% step. And those are really the kind of the highlights of the
Greg, on the overtime, because in years past we've had the discussion where you need to be fully staffed rather than paying a lot of overtime. Do you have, here it says that this is to, what you're asking for is to reflect expected actual costs. Do you have people that are out on disability or?
I do. This year, we just had a firefighter retire because of a disability, and we hired and we've got a person in. He's trained. He's ready to go. Last week, I was notified by a firefighter due to a medical issue he has to retire, and so that puts us down one. I have a firefighter out right now because of a knee surgery. I expect him back first or second week in February. So I do have a couple of vacancies right now that are hurting us. When I look at my overtime and how it's tracking to last year, we are below last year's levels this time year to date. So we're tracking a little bit lower, and we're in a little bit better shape because of the injuries. But we are going to be down a firefighter. And we're looking to fill that position as well.
Page 62, Camille, has sort of the top block is the salaries. The third line up is the overtime. So you can see the history of that from $421,000 actual in 2011 and tracking and proposed at $355,000 this year.
Last year on the overtime, so I did an analysis for Finance Committee, and I couldn't guarantee that we would have a long-term savings by putting on a firefighter. Because of the cost of the firefighter, I couldn't say, yes, if we put one on, I could project to save a certain amount of money. Thank you.
So you want to go over the expenses you've done?
The expenses, I'm sorry, on the expenses, I just have a highlighter thing. I'll have to run through. We just, thank you. We adjusted, we made some reductions to the expenses, but we raised a couple of line items. Ambulance service is increasing about $3,300, and in that account I paid for, we used to pay for ambulance licensing fees, our controlled substances licenses that we need to operate, and also our we have to pay a fee to the Region 3 office of $1,000. So those are all the fees that we have to pay to the Commonwealth in order to run an ambulance. Included in that is also a $7,600 fee for maintenance agreement for all our defibrillators. They have to be maintained properly, so they work properly. And then a $3,300 fee for our software program. Keep that up and running. Uniforms went up slightly just because of a contract change, and then we made some reductions to some of the line items in order to save a little bit of money. That's essentially the changes for the expense side. So a little bit of moving around and a little bit of mandatory charges.
Do you have any questions, Steve?
Yes, sure, thank you. Chief, how many defibrillators do we have?
We have, let's see, we have 6 12-lead defibrillators. We have 2 in our first line ambulance, and we have a 12-lead defibrillator on each of our 3 pieces of our fire apparatus. And then we have semi-automatic defibrillators that are in on our reserve engines, and also in the cars that we drive.
How old are those?
We received a grant to replace them probably 3 years ago. And we include that on our capital plan.
Right. Okay.
And do you, as part of this is the defibs that we have in police cars and so forth? As part of your maintenance contract?
Yeah,
We got them all at the same time.
We bought them all at the same time.
And is are they all on your maintenance contract?
We haven't got them on there yet, no. We have not.
we pay our
Separate.
maintenance, right? We cover our maintenance.
What the service agreement does is the technician comes out periodically, he runs it through a test. If the batteries are bad, they'll replace the batteries, and if the unit goes down, they give us a loaner unit.
So they were all bought at the same time?
Yes.
So shouldn't we be every year getting rid of?
Well, they're in the capital plan for replacement.
Oh, they are, okay.
So, you know, I mean, one theory is you buy them over time and then you just replace one a year. In this instance, it just made most sense to just do it all at one time and then just put it in capital and replace all at one time.
And we got a grant for it, so
Oh.
by getting the grant, we were able to take it off the capital plan.
Oh,
So,
good, right.
that-
Yeah, and you have another question, Steve? My question, the ambulance service, do we have a really tight, and I mean, exhaustive replacement for all of the equipment in a capital plan? I mean, I'd like to think that we're keeping right up to date on all the medical technologies, et cetera, that the ambulances have to provide.
Yes, I think we're doing a good job there. We don't have a bottomless pit for money where we can go out and buy whatever we want to do, but what we've done is we've looked for any advancement that we can on a number of levels. With equipment, we've purchased that IO. It's a way to give intravenous fluids when you can't get a line into somebody. It goes right into the bone. We purchased several years ago a Broslow Hingle bag that's about this big. It's for pediatric trauma that allows the paramedic to size the child, and then within the size appropriate for that child in a compartment is in the tracheal tubes, everything that they need to treat that child. We have put defibrillators on all our fire apparatus, the 12 leads that allow, if we have a paramedic on a fire apparatus, we make sure we have a 12-lead in paramedic supply so he can work as a paramedic. And we're kind of unique in that area. Nobody around us is doing that yet. There are departments that are running ALS, but they're not running ALS engines that I'm aware of. So if our ambulance is at a call, we can get an ALS piece of fire apparatus arrive there.
I hear from all of my colleagues the amazement when Reading Fire shows up in their community.
Is that right? Well, that's great.
The other thing that we're doing, we just, with that ambulance software, now we have a year of data. I was looking at that today. So now we can really kind of track our data and use that to enhance our service. So we'll try to do it every which way, and within our budget. And we try to use grants in order to enhance that, those defibrillator grants. Otherwise, each one of those 12-lead defibrillators I talked about, they're in the neighborhood of $22,000–$23,000. So it's very expensive for me to come to the community and say, I need 3 more 12-lead defibrillators at $70,000. But by identifying that grant and being able to get the grant, we're able to expand that program out. Now, you can't give any medications without doing 12-lead EKG. So that starts the whole process.
Good. Okay, anything else?
No.
Any
Any
questions?
other questions?
Ben, you all set?
Yeah, I'm all set, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Police Department's on pages 64 to 68 in their budget books.
See this, wow. And I'd be happy to have Greg do the, minutes on my defibs if he'd like to from this point on, he'd be fine. In the police budget, as you can see from the handout that I gave you along with the slide that Bob's got up here, we are in the process of some labor negotiations. There is a fairly significant increase in the overall budget, and there's a number of major factors for that. Just review them. We would like to anticipate adding additional officers we spoke about on a couple of occasions prior to tonight to the police department. Also, taking the assumption that potentially we'll be taking into the police department budget 1.5 FTEs through our CASA. So those are fairly major factors in the increase in the budget as you see in front of it. Overtime has increased. I know you mentioned overtime with Greg, and we'll mention it here. There's a few different reasons for the increase in overtime. One of them is to take into account the potential contractual obligations that we're in the process of negotiating. Also, we've been doing a really careful study of the past history, and we're trying to right-size that budget. We have a good idea of where it should be, and we think we're getting very close to it. It's been pretty much underfunded for a number of years. And also, as we spoke about on previous occasions, trying to do a little bit more work with the increased officers that we've got built in here.
Could I ask?
Sure.
The other, now this officer is in response to the substance abuse issue, correct?
Yes.
That's why we're adding this particular officer.
Correct.
That's
Yes.
a
But then-
community priority.
Yeah, and then you talked about one that maybe would come on board because of increased development. And that would be in the fall, and that's not in this budget.
No. And, that's part of the discussion that we had around the Pulte development, and the chief has been requesting a new officer too for a number of years, but obviously understands the financial situation that we're in. But, you can see the request for services and activity levels in the town, and we just need the horsepower to be out there and be able to manage that.
I think it begs the question, we hear we have a low crime rate, and yet our crime is increasing.
Yes.
So it's
Right.
low, but it's going up.
Correct, yeah, we have a lower crime rate than the state average and the national average for similar demographics, but for the statistics that we're used to, it is increasing, and it's increased rather dramatically in the last couple of years in some areas. You know, as you look at the charts that I provided, you do see a little dip in a couple of areas this year, but they're, you know, that's just a normal up and down. It's not going to be exactly the same every year, but you see a couple of years ago we had a pretty significant increase in our break-in and entrance. That includes both motor vehicle and house B&Es, and it's stayed exactly the same this year. It's taken a pretty dramatic leap, and we've stayed consistent now for 2 years in a row. So, you know, we're a fairly safe town in relationship to the rest of the state, but for what we're used to, you know, we've seen a bit of an increase, and we want to be proactive in addressing that and get it back to where we like it. You know, as I mentioned in here, we still have, with this budget, eliminated a lot of any of the discretional spending that we've had in place in the past. It did not incorporate any extra time in here for some of the events that we've spoken about in the past, such as RAD, or providing services for things such as Friends and Family Day or tree lighting and things like that. That's not part of this. This is a you know, a service budget, oriented budget. I just want to make sure that you notice that. I'm sorry. The vehicles? Yeah, I was going to go to the expense part if we were done with that initial part. On the expense side, there's an increase in the expense side of the budget as well. There's a couple of reasons for that. In past budgets, the last 2 years, I did eliminate a fair amount of money for clothing and equipment, and part of that was because we weren't in the process of hiring new officers, and to outfit and equip and train a new officer with all the costs, there's about $5,000 per officer. So we anticipate, I'm hoping for an additional officer, as well as we've been made aware that there will be a retirement coming up in the summertime. So we'd be anticipating 2 officers at least going through an academy and needing to be outfitted and trained. So approximately $10,000 in cost there. Also, you probably have heard that Ford has stopped making the Crown Victoria model police cruiser. We'll all be wearing morning bands when that finally ends. But yeah, the Crown Vic is done. We still do have a couple more months before they're completely eliminated. But Ford has redesigned the Taurus model to make it as a police vehicle. Not to say that that's absolutely going to be the car that we go with. I think what we're going to do is take this opportunity to look at the other models that are out there and that are available, because one of the main reasons for staying with the same model car, first of all, is because the mechanics of the DPW work with mostly Ford vehicles, and that seems to make sense, is to stick in that same family. But the equipment, they keep the car basically the same size, so we can transfer light bars and equipment from inside the vehicle, the radio holders and stuff like that, and just take them out of one and move them over to the other car, and we can ship a lot of pieces of equipment like that, so we don't have to buy new every year. With the change in the cars such as this, it's going to require complete upfitting on these new cars. It's going to, be at least a one-time expense as we get back into getting the right size equipment, and then we can start upfitting and sharing the equipment near the end. So we're going to take this opportunity to look at other models, look at the Chevys, look at the Dodges and the Fords, and find out what the best is for us going forward. It could be to stay with the Ford in the new vehicle, but we anticipate some significant upfitting costs to get that new equipment in place, new light bars and consoles and things like that. And what we do with the Cruisers, not to bore you with all the details, but we take the back seats out and we put in a cage or a plastic divider. That's going to not going to be the same size, but you remove those plastic insert seats in the back that can be easily cleaned out and maintained. Those that have to be new, things like that. So there's a fair amount to it. So those are some of the significant increases in the expense side of the budget. One of the things we did also do in the expense side of the budget, however, and Bob noted it on the slide, I believe, is that we had in our budget, traffic light repairs. Quite frankly, not our area of expertise. We talked to Jeff and George Zamboris. The engineers have a fair amount more knowledge in that area than we do. Thought it would probably be more appropriate in the engineering budget for them to oversee that. We'll still work with them because we're 24-hour a day. We'll know when they get broken in the middle of the night and things like that, report to them and communicate with them. The budget, it would make sense for them to oversee the actual work and make sure it's done right. So that would be moving from my budget to Public Works. And that was the expense side of that.
Ben?
Yeah, Chief, you know, so back to the B&E activity.
Yep.
You were using the community alerts and some other mechanisms to remind folks about reasonable steps that they can take to, you know, help protect their property a little bit better. Are you going to continue to do
Absolutely.
some of that kind of outreach and communication?
As the opportunities present themselves, and again, it's a fine balance with using that system. We want to make sure that they're timely messages and that we're not continuing to address areas that people aren't interested in because then they tune us out. So we don't want to overuse it, but yeah, absolutely, as the opportunities present themselves, we expect to make good use of that Everbridge system. And we do encourage everybody that's watching to go and log into the Everbridge system, the Reading Alerts, Reading Community Alerts, RCA, and you know, you can pick different parts of the community alert system that you'd like to be part of to get information. In an emergency situation, we're going to tell everybody in town, we send it out to the entire community. But you can log in and give us information and sign up for DPW information or police and fire public safety information or get financial information from the finance department and just pick those specific areas. And sometimes we'll send information just out to those particular groups that signed up because it's not necessarily an emergency information message that we need to send to the entire community, but we're just going to target the people who want information from us.
Not only that, we do have members of the press, or local press, who would be interested in, you know, that kind of information that might help our residents. Thank you, Chief.
Sure.
Okay. Steve, you're all set? Okay, thanks, Jim.
Dispatch, we wanted a dispatch budget and
Pages 69 to 71.
the dispatch budget is staying, you know, with just a modest increase overall. We're abiding by the current labor negotiation contract. We have a contract in place with the dispatchers, so we'll be meeting our contractual obligations. Any non-union employees in this area get a 2% step. We did reduce slightly the state grant that we've been using to offset some of the expenses last year, and that was only because the state did actually ultimately reduce a little bit on our end, a little bit less than what we had planned on last year. So we want to try to get it right in the area we were comfortable with, so that we're not caught short. And as you know, I always mention we are using that money to offset some of the dispatch salaries. It is a grant, however, we expect it to continue, but remember, as I say, every year grants sometimes will go away. One of the other things that we've done in this budget on the expense side is we have moved the public safety software license. The fire department and I and the police department are working jointly on public safety software at this point, and the licensing fees have gone up a little bit. We did have them in the dispatch budget on the expense side. Thought it would be prudent at this point to move them over to finance and IT, which they take care of all our IT needs townwide anyway, and just have it all consolidated as opposed to both of us trying to, you know, split it all with the same company. So, you know, we did put in some small professional development expenses in here. We do have some increased demands from the state level on the dispatchers in terms of the emergency medical dispatch, as well as training demands. However, I will tell you that those are going into effect this coming July. We're already well ahead of the curve on that. We've been doing what they expect us to do long before their demand has been done. So all the dispatchers are properly trained, they're EMD certified, and we're good to go with the state requirements that are put in place. But what's going to occur is, though, you know, we are going to have some additional certification expenses to keep up with.
Chief, one thing I forgot to ask about under the main budget
Sure.
is for this year, next year, what you have in there for the RAD program?
There's
Anything?
not.
There's
I
not.
did mention that we did not include any discretion, I call that kind of discretionary funding, if you will. It's not the day-to-day operational type of things that we provide. I had eliminated most of that last year. I'm still waiting this year. If I can at all make it happen with this year's budget, I will. I expect to. I do like the program very much. It's very worthwhile, but it is one of those things that when times are really tough, it's not an essential product for us to put out.
The cost is about $5,200 a
Oh,
session.
yeah, around $5,000 per session.
And how many people are you training in one of those sessions?
20 to 25. We explored the options of charging, you know, because we do it free of charge. When we began the program, it was all grant funded, and you know, it was a great thing to offer. But you know, we explored in the past year, you know, we explored partnering with some private aid entities within the community to help offset the costs, but there's a lot of logistics involved in those things and what people expect for their investments, as well as, you know, if you're going to start charging people, it actually does get pretty pricey when you're looking at, you know, a few $100s for a course like that.
But you do see a lot of the emails and letters.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
stuff.
people like them.
It's a great course. It offers a lot of benefit. It really does, and there's a lot of great stories that come out of it about, you know, people going off to college and protecting themselves at school and things like that, or at workplace, you know, environments. You know, I can't say enough about it, but it's, you know, it is one of those things that's not a call for service type of a response for us in these tough budget times. That's what we're focusing on.
Can you just give us an update on the regionalization of the dispatch
Sure.
center?
Yep, Chief Burns and I have both been working on that together along with the other communities. They've actually expanded the group to include North Reading and Linfield. Both of those towns are also interested in this concept. We've recently received another planning grant, approximately $400,000, to go and start exploring some basic architectural type plans, things like that potentially, and try to find a site. Actually, part of my duties in the group is to contact the National Guard and talk to them about possibly some use down there at Camp Curtis. They've been receptive. I've talked to the colonel that I've been working with on this a few times, but it's been difficult to try to get them to come out and sit down and talk to us face to face. But on the telephone, they're interested in looking at it. They're absolutely not opposed to, you know, at first blush anyway. They're not saying no, it can't happen. So, you know, we are still pursuing, moving forward, and we're trying to get see where it's going to lead to.
There's also special legislation pending, which I don't think has been approved yet.
I don't think so. Not yet. Oh, ours? Yes, ours has.
Okay.
Ours has been approved, yeah.
Which would basically set up the legal mechanism.
Yes.
Because this is basically creates a new governmental entity in effect, which is a Eastern Middlesex Regional Dispatch operation, and so it needs to have bonding authority for things like facilities and all that. There's a lot of money available for this kind of thing. We've been getting grants right along, and Essex County just got a year ago, they got $3.5 million grant for construction, and I think they're well into construction, as I understand.
Yes.
They're on the jail
Sure.
site up in Middleton. But it's a lot, and getting the communities to agree, you know, particularly when we come from very different places with dispatch. We have, obviously we think ours is the most professionalized dispatch, but also it is a civilian dispatch. Stoneham has a civilian dispatch. Wakefield, the police and firefighters dispatch, so does Melrose. So you have to take all those things, labor issues and all that sort of thing, and bring it all together and make it work, and then create a governance structure for it.
Okay.
In looking at those other communities, I think it's important to note that we do, you know, I'll stand up there and say it. We've got the best dispatch corps of the group currently. We're staffed 24 hours a day, fully staffed. All of our people are up to all the certifications. You know, we are probably the most advanced. I know we're the most advanced of anybody in the group. A lot of the departments that we're speaking with, both fire and police, still using fire and police personnel to man their desks, and the ones that are using civilian dispatchers are not fully staffed with the civilians. They still share some of the resources or the use of the police and fire people to do it. So, you know, we need to make sure, if you know, and be very careful going forward to make sure that we get something more than what we currently have.
Well, that's
in
what I
order to
was
go there.
thinking.
Okay, and just so you know, that's would be one of my concerns in the future. Is that there's got to be some benefit to the town of Reading in order to move in that direction, because we don't have the driving force that a lot of the other communities have behind us. Our dispatch center is working just fine. You know, we need to get a little something out of that that's going to benefit us and give us better quality service in order for us to make that move.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Great.
Who do we have next, Bob?
Pete, town administration on pages 28 to 30.
It's fairly simple, no new staff. The standard that we used is 2% step if eligible. It has a small level of increase over time due to meeting minutes. If the board wants to guarantee us to meet less, then we can keep that where it is, but that may not happen. We do have increased lease costs for the document storage. We're sort of the main area for document storage process. We are proposing reducing legal expenses based on recent trends. You know, there's some risk there if we all of a sudden start to ramp up legal issues, then obviously that wouldn't work. But where we are right now, we think it's doable. Last year we spent
39,000.
39,000. What we're budgeting for town council this year is 55,000. Next year, this year we're budgeted 60,000. So I'd rather be on the more comfortable side of that. In Labor Council, we have budgeted at 12,000 as we had in the past. Property and casualty insurance, we're showing an estimated increase of 7.6%. We'll have a more real number in about a month, just about when this budget has to go to bed. So we'll plug in a as realistic a number as we can.
So that's it?
That's it. It all fits on one page. And if you like that, you'll really like it.
Now we go to accounting and finance. Were there any questions on town administration?
It's way too confusing.
It was too much detail, right? Ben, are you all set?
Yeah.
Okay. So Gail, we have you in the hot seat.
I pretty much said everything I need to say.
Accounting is 31 and 32.
We've got the one-step increase for each of our employees there. We haven't changed any of the hours. There was a slight reduction in hours last year. One of our clerks in particular helps during crunch time when a lot of the bills come in and they just need to be opened and sorted to make it easier for the people in the tax collector's office to do the data entry that they need to do. So it helps if everything's already set up or envelopes slit and checks sorted and things like that. So during those times, she spends a couple hours a day helping them out, getting that stuff sorted, and so that works out well because they are running, I think, a half-person short in that office from last year's cuts. So, but otherwise, it's just that step increase for each of our employees, and then my expenses are basically some professional development and any supplies and equipment we need for records retention, vendors boxes, and accordion and folders and things like that. We've cut a little bit out of the education and the office supplies, just to kind of do our share, I guess. And the office supplies has decreased a bit over the years, so we've cut a little bit out of that. But I think we haven't considered at all in here the change in personnel that's going to take place next year. So that's something that will have to be discussed as we move along. That's on next week's agenda for discussion. So we'll want to consider maybe the education line, depending on the person that we get in there. We might have to help them out a little bit with something there, but it's a small enough number that can handle the town meeting adjustments, something like that.
Steve, any question? Ben?
You haven't changed your mind.
We're still
I
working
just
on it.
closed down the house in Florida.
Well, congratulations.
Small details, we're still working on it.
Yes, we're going to miss you, Gail. Yeah. So, Munis is under control.
Yes, yeah, we're actually using the general billing piece a little bit more as we kind of settle into using the product. General billing is what we're using for ambulance billing right now.
Good.
And we just finished a few months ago converting all of the water type connections. Those billings used to be done by hand, someone just type a letter. Now we've got that all in the Munis general billing system, and eventually we'll get some engineering bills that go out when they do some work for the utilities, Verizon and stuff. They've done a little work there, and this way we can keep track of all these people we've sent letters to that say they owe us money. Now we'll have an actual record of it instead of a letter in a department that might get lost in the shuffle. So it's working out really well that we're kind of expanding the use of that.
Well, we had to put a new water service in, and it was last spring. I didn't get a bill until December. I did pay it.
Well, hopefully now we'll be able to.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised that there was that much of a delay for the billing.
We don't forget, we're just a little slow.
Right, so that'll take care of that.
That'll help.
Yeah, because I couldn't remember if I had paid it or not.
Well, and obviously we're doing the big stuff, you know, water bills, tax bills,
Yeah.
and all that sort of thing.
These are
So,
very frequent.
yeah, so after you get those done, you can get down into some of these smaller things that are just time consuming per bill and hard to track, and it just makes it change.
Well, those are things that could get lost in the shuffle.
Yep.
And they're not small bills.
No, they're not,
It
but
was
they're not,
like
they're not frequent
$900
bills.
to-
It's, you know,
Not
it's not like the
Right.
size of our whole water and sewer enterprises.
Yeah. Okay, any questions? Bob, are you done with your slideshow?
Yep, I'm on the hot seat next.
Your what?
Finance department's on the hot seat next.
Okay.
Come to
This will
visit,
take at
Bob.
least an hour.
Because it's such a big
Want to
department.
bet?
Okay. Where's the fire, Greg? The page, it starts on page 33 in your handout, and really the changes can be highlighted by 3 items. And I won't go into detail with the assessors, because the board does want to come in next week and present their budget. But we have, in this version, put in $24,000 to restore the part-time seasonal appraisal that we discussed quite a bit last year. As Jim mentioned, we have $21,500 of software licenses moved over from public safety now that we're going to have a combined police and fire system, which I think will work out really well. And we have additional elections scheduled for next year, which cost $17,000. So really those 3 factors are the reason the budget is up at all. It would be up, I think it's, there it is, 0.4% if it weren't for those 3 factors. In terms of departments, you can look on page 33 and see once again, the changes I just highlighted. You can see in assessors and technology, and then elections are the 3 areas of increase. I think that in terms of staffing, the one thing to talk about is really technology. A few years ago, we added a 4th person, and it certainly saved our collective hides. Right now, we're spending in next year's budget $187,000 on software licenses. So just think about that for a while. That's 3 employees. If you go back almost 5 years this spring, when the town meeting approved $1.25 million for technology improvements, we knew full well there'd be 15% or so of that as annual costs, and that's about what this figure works out to.
And I really have to tip my hat to the technology department, especially to Gail and to all the staff that have used the technology. The public and the selectmen still have not seen it all, but it's tremendous internally. We are working so much more efficiently and effectively internally that it's great. And I think I said this maybe in the fall, and it may have to happen a little slower than I hope, but it is rolling out to the public. You'll start to see it. The license and permit system, we still hope to do a demo sometime early in the spring for you. Document storage is a little harder to demonstrate, but Paula can tell you how she sits there now and drinks coffee and pretends to work for half an hour while she looks up to it. It used to take 2 hours. We're really, and if you saw the grant application for Melrose, Wakefield, and Reading that we held, we're really miles ahead of most communities in terms of integrating our technology. Well, many towns have the technology we have, or some of them do, but they don't integrate it. There's little kingdoms that all use their little piece of software, all by themselves, don't talk to each other, they don't communicate within systems. So, for instance, it'll be a policy question, but if someone comes to pull a permit and they don't have a dog license, we'll know that. If they haven't paid their water bill, we'll know that. So there's all kinds of internal information that will be circulating that I think will be pretty effective. This budget doesn't increase really technology spending, but after a pretty long discussion with the superintendent, that's one of our chief concerns. It's at a high level for software licenses, but as you know, technology changes so quickly that as a municipal government, it's not easy to stay on top of this sort of thing. We don't, by any means, want to be on the cutting edge, not even really close to it. But we really can't afford to fall too far behind. And I think in the next 2 years, we'll face another decision as to whether we need to do a better job training other employees to use the technology and help themselves, or whether we need to start hiring more technology staff. In most businesses, we find the first approach, because generally there's a lot of turnover, there's young people coming into businesses. You don't need to train them, they can train you. But in our job, if you look our FTE list of 204, we haven't really had a lot of turnover, and we don't really project a lot. This is not a business where we're bringing in a lot of 20-year-olds every year that can teach us technology. So that's going to be the next decision point, is how we handle kind of that need for knowledge in technology. In terms of going forward on page 35, here's actually a list of all the different systems I just told you on the bottom of the page. Total 187,000. I think it's 11 or 12 systems. Some of them are fairly small, but some of them are fairly large. The other comment I'll make is, in addition to adding a seasonal appraiser, we did reduce half of the clerical job. Jeff had a retirement early in the fall in the water and sewer department, and we decided to move that function into the collector's office. So we essentially saved half of the position, and may potentially be able to save more. We'll see. But we have a collector now doing the water and sewer work, if you will. And having a new set of eyes on it has really, I don't know, I'll let Jeff speak to it, but it seems like we're getting good return. She's seen things that, again, not only is it a new set of eyes, it's a whole new department looking at an issue. So I know when Gail started and brought Munis in, we had a lot of people saying, well, this is the way to do it. And Gail quite rightly pointed out to them, not anymore. You have to explain why. It's always good for an organization to have that ability to look at what it's doing from someone else's eyes and say, it doesn't really make any sense, why do you do it this way? And I think in this particular case, the clerk that's taken over has really embraced the idea of doing it right. She sat through Gail's lectures about how to do Munis correctly, and she made some changes that would be technical in nature and not that obvious, but it's really nice to see employees interested in making improvements like that, effectively cutting half a job.
Does the town clerk have sufficient staffing?
The town clerk currently especially is doing a fair amount of technology work. If it weren't for that, the office is adequately staffed, but because we're asking her to do some technology, it's tough. So she's very involved in the document storage project, for instance. That's her background. And many town clerks are involved in document storage. It's kind of a central location. So they have almost three people full-time in that office all the time now. It's better staffed than it has been in the past, but again, because we're pulling around it, sometimes it's a bit tricky.
What did it used to be, Pete? I mean, I think we've cut town clerk a lot.
Not recently.
No.
It's actually probably a higher level. We were down at,
You had just over 2 FTEs.
two and a
or
quarter
4 people
FTEs.
divided up.
Yeah,
So,
Carol was the only full-time person at one point.
right. And that goes back maybe 3 or 4 years that we were at that level. Yeah, where it really stretches is when you have a lot of elections in a year. Because, you know, the election cost that's shown in here, that's the incremental cost of an election, you know, the poll workers and all of that kind of stuff. But that doesn't include the additional workload on the part of the town clerk. So, you know, this year, March 6th is going to be a stretch because running 2 elections is more difficult than, running 2 elections at one time is more difficult than running 1 election. It's not as hard as running 2. And then we've got a September election and a November election, so this is just a very busy calendar year coming up for elections. But following year, you only have 1, so. The thing that I just want to mention about the assessor's office is that we've asked for information from the board about the need for the associate appraiser and some statistics about inspections and all that sort of thing. We have not got that information yet, so this is in here as a possibility, but not as a recommendation at this point.
the
Because I
budget
wanted-
the budget that you're showing.
Correct. But I want to see that before I would tell you that, yes, we think this is a good
All right, so is that the end of
That
the
wraps
budget?
up tonight, yep.
This is it? Geez, I can't see the clock. How are we doing?
Not even 9 o'clock.
Oh, we're really doing well. So with that, are we done with evening?
one. You are?
There's nothing else to come before the board? Could I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second, Steve?
Second.
All those in favor? 2-0.